Yeah, when I was asked to help with these presentations, this was an obvious one to bring up because just a little bit of background, I was a chief officer at councils for over 25 years. I also was a part-time parish clerk for 8 years, some of that coterminous with my chief officer role. And I was also a national advisor for the SLCC for 10 years and helping people with issues. So one thing I've picked up a lot over the years is a lot of the basic mistakes and sometimes quite comprehensive mistakes that clerks make, which usually comes back to bite them. And at our current company, we are continuously carrying out investigations at councils. We've actually got 3 going at the moment. We've got 3 more commissioned, which we can't start until we finish some of the ones we're doing. Probably 70% of them are to do with councillor behaviour, but 30% often are either jointly clerk issues or solely clerk issues. And a lot of them are actually mistakes that clerk makes in not getting things right. So this is to try and help you to make sure you don't fall into one of those areas of making those mistakes. I won't go through the agenda because the contents of the train session, I think we've mostly covered that with Stuart. This is just a brief oversight of the policies that you should have in place as a council. And it's the responsibility of the clerk as the HR advisor to make sure these are there. You may say, well, I'm not a HR specialist. Even as the smallest parish council, you still have that responsibility. It's often a mistake that clerks make where they say, well, the council haven't given me a policy. Well, you're the proper officer. You are responsible for providing them with policies to adopt. So it is important that you do get these in place. There's lots of policies that you can have. There's some that you must have. Disciplinary and grievance being 2 that you must have in place, along with things like holidays and parental guide leave, etc. You should have those in place just to make things easier for you. One thing I would say is a good time to get all of these policies in place is when your relationships are good. Those who've been through elections will know that sometimes a council can change after an election. Sometimes it can be consistent and it's equally as good as it was before. But if things turn bad at a council with councillors, it's really hard to get in place policies once they turn bad. So when things are good, it's a really good time to make sure you're on top of all your policies. There's also the policies that you should have in place, such as the sexual harassment policy that's coming up soon. That's a duty for the employer, and it's going to include prevention of sexual harassment by third parties, which is going to be interesting to say the least in our sector. I expect a lot of cases coming through as a result of that once it does come into play fully. Redundancy, retirement, etc., flexible work, performance management, and more. So there's plenty of other policies there that you can have. Equality and diversity should run through all of your policies in accordance with the Equality Act, and the 7 criteria there. I won't go through them all. But you should also have a program in place to review your policy. So I always recommend that every policy has a date that was adopted at the bottom, but also a date that it's going to be reviewed. Some can be 1 year, some like your standard orders and financial regulations, but others you may make them 3 years unless the legislation changes, in which case you'll have to do it a bit quicker. But generally speaking, 3 years for most policies is okay. But you need to keep your eye on the ball to make sure nothing changes during those 3 years. Common mistakes in key policies is this is an often seen mistake, is that the disciplinary and grievance policy is for councils where they have more than 1 employee, so you have a team of employees. It doesn't cater very well for the clerk scenario. So for a employee, the disciplinary will be managed by the clerk. But when it becomes a disciplinary relating to the clerk, that becomes a lot more complicated because in effect, you're very often relying on an amateur Sometimes you're lucky enough to have counsellors with HR experience, but you're generally speaking relying on someone without HR experience to then conduct either an investigation, disciplinary, or a grievance hearing. That needs to be catered for in your policy beforehand. And going back to what I said just now, the time to make sure that's done right is when relationships are good, not when you're in the middle of a disciplinary or a grievance. It's much more difficult to resolve the problems then. So the key is to make sure it does cater for a process where it's the clerk who's made a grievance or where it's the clerk who is the subject to a disciplinary or a grievance against them. In both policies, it should require the mayor to seek support, ideally from professional support, and that should be somebody or some organisation that you've got lined up ready to do that. Again, when times are good, that's the time to organise this. The mechanism of dealing with it should be fully established and set up as part of the annual meeting. So when you need to think about who's going to do a disciplinary and who's going to do the appeal, if there's an appeal or a grievance and the appeal. If an officer can consider a disciplinary or a grievance and then the appeal can go to a committee, make sure that's set up properly in your annual meeting and within your policy as well. If it's the clerk, obviously the clerk can't deal with the initial disciplinary or grievance. You're going to need a committee, subcommittee or committee to deal with the initial disciplinary or grievance. And then you're going to need an appeals committee in place to deal with an appeal if there is one. And that's got to be made up of separate councillors from the original committee. So getting that again in place before there's an issue is the key. If this is all in place, it just becomes second nature that you have these committees in place. And you can use, for example, you could use your staffing committee to have two subcommittees. One would be the initial disciplinary or grievance subcommittee, and the other would be the appeals subcommittee. So the staffing committee gets split in two, and therefore you don't have anyone sitting on both the original substantive matter and on the appeal. Right, the two had a position of the clerk. So as the proper officer of the council, you're also required to provide the advice on HR to the council as well, as are other things as well, like financial advice, usually the RFO, especially in the smaller councils, health and safety. So those of you, I'm sure this you've learned by now, but sometimes councils make the mistake of advertising a clerk vacancy and stating it's someone to come along and take the minutes and do the agendas. There's an awful lot more to it than that if you're going to get things right. Most clerks will have nothing more than a basic understanding of HR. Some do. I was talking to a clerk yesterday who's just completed a CIPD diploma, which is excellent, but not many have gone that far. It's important to have everything in place, as I mentioned, and having that done while things are good, while they're going well. Ideally, you'll have some form of HR advisor to support the council if there's an issue arises. And this is to the benefit of both parties, both the council and yourself. We often deal with cases where this isn't in place, and it means that the council make mistakes, but it also makes it incredibly stressful for the clerk. We've dealt with a number of cases recently where the clerk probably needed a long period of sickness absence afterwards, after the matter was dealt with, because of the amount of stress they've gone through, because systems weren't really in place. It just made it incredibly stressful for the clerk. One of them, I'm pretty sure that she will never ever be a clerk again because of all the stress that was encountered during the process. And actually, the councillors were keen to point out that was her mistake and not getting the policies in place. So that made it even more stressful for her. So it was a very difficult scenario we dealt with there that did result in a settlement agreement. The clerk needs to ensure the council is made aware of its duty of care to the clerk and its other officers. So there is a common law duty of care to take care of your employees This does present some issues, especially in light of the Harvey against Ledbury case, which basically said you can't punish town councillors or parish councillors. However, you can take action to protect your employees. So you're not punishing the councillor, you are supporting the employee. Now that's challengeable. We're not saying that that is a guaranteed. It is challengeable, but the other option is you allow, usually in these instances, the clerk to be continuously bullied by a councillor, and the council takes no action, sits on its hands. That usually results in significant stress for all parties. Again, that's sadly an area we get involved in quite a lot. Yes. What if the clerk's in conflict with the council? First thing is, policy should be in place that makes life so much easier for everybody. The clerk being bullied at work does not want to return to the office looking at, oh, it's a typo there, beg your pardon, looking at long-term sick leave. Some councillors don't want the clerk back. That is the type of scenario we come across quite a lot. There is, as I mentioned earlier, there is the possibility of the council deciding they are going to take action to exercise its duty of care to protect the clerk. It is usually the clerk. It's not very often another officer, so I'll just use the clerk in this context. To protect the clerk, and they will exercise that duty of care by, for example, removing the errant councillor or councillors from all committees, not as a punishment, but to protect the clerk. They'll also remove them from being able to attend the council offices, again, to protect the employees, and if necessary, could seek an injunction to prevent them attending at all, which would eventually result in them no longer being a councillor due to the 6-month absence. That hasn't happened so far, and as I've mentioned earlier, this does come with some risks because it is challengeable because of the Harvey and Ledbury case. However, what we say is that you distinguish it in that it's not a punishment, it's a measure to prevent bullying and harassment of the clerk rather than a punishment of the councillor. The clerk should secure professional support and advice for the councillors and point them in the direction of, example, pre-arranged HR support. That does make it much better for everybody, in our experience. Where there isn't any support for the councillors, it just makes it a lot more stressful for the clerk. The clerk obviously has support from the SLCC if they're a member of that, and they can seek support from a union, an alternative union as well. In such a scenario, it's still the responsibility of the clerk to run the risk assessment and look at ways to ameliorate any risks. So the clerk still in those instances needs to look at professionally how can they ameliorate risks for the council. That could involve making recommendations as to action the council can take to prevent the bullying or harassment if that's what's going on. It can be setting up mediation. It can be getting in some HR support or recommending the council, for example, commissions an external investigation to try and resolve the issues. So there can be various things the clerk can recommend to try and ameliorate the risk. Move on to performance management. Performance management is essential for any well-functioning organisation. It's a system whereby you establish the objectives set for officers during the coming period. It improves performance of employees in the organisation, in this case the council, and you're also holding people who account for the performance as well. One of our biggest inquiries from clerks often is that they have a member of staff that they haven't performance managed, and that leads to severe problems because if it doesn't get dealt with quickly, it can be corrosive to the organisation, but also it's much more difficult to deal with it. And very often there's been no logs made or contemporaneous notes or emails or warnings given. So even though the behaviour may have been going on for sometimes as long as 12 months, they basically have to start from scratch because they haven't recorded anything. So it may take them another 3 to 6 months before they're in a position to remove them from the organisation legally. So it is important you have systems of performance management, both for the positive and the negative. as I've just outlined there. You should also have your performance management system should align your objectives as officers with the objectives of the council. Ideally, the council will have a strategic plan in place. It can be as simple as one side of A4, this is what we're going to achieve this year, or it can be a comprehensive document. That's entirely up to the council how detailed you want to have that. So that is an important document you have, but you then align your objectives with the strategic plan of the council that you set in your individual appraisal. Research does show, we did some research on this, that generally speaking, clerks are poor at performance managing their teams. Generally speaking, not all. Often the excuse is they're too busy to do it. Sometimes they lack the confidence to do it or the wherewithal. And sometimes the clerk is fearful of being appraised because it may result in negativity in their view, or they may have had one bad experience of an appraisal as well. It's certainly not a false economy to do appraisals because it does make the council and the organisation much more productive and coherent, and also aligns you around your strategy as well as delivering training that aligns with your strategy as well as what you require as a council. So overall, it does improve the effectiveness and efficiency of the council, as well as, in my experience, job satisfaction, but also the psychological contract with the employer as well, which is important to have. So what does performance management look like? It does include, obviously, an annual appraisal, often a 6-month review as well. There should also be regular one-to-ones with line managers and their employees. That can vary depending on the individuals and how they find it works for them. I know some people who do weekly one-to-ones with some staff, but equally do fortnightly with others and monthly with others. It just depends on the nature of the role and the individuals concerned, how often you do those. For a clerk, the regular one-to-one meeting is often not a one-to-one. It's the clerk and maybe 2 or 3 councillors, lead councillors, maybe it's the chair of staff and the mayor. I had a system at my last council where I met with all the lead councillors once a month. We had a strict agenda of 1 hour for that meeting, which worked really well. And basically we reviewed where we were with the strategic objectives that we were currently processing at that time. So we kept totally aligned around our strategic objectives as a council. The annual review of the strategic delivery program is also a part of this to make sure that you do review where you are with your strategic plan. And where there's poor performance, this should be dealt with promptly. As I mentioned earlier, the longer you leave it, the more difficult it is. And also you must log things where there's poor performance. So normally, if, for example, just give a scenario, if an employee is seen driving the council vehicle without the seatbelt on, and you've had a report to the office that they drive around without the seatbelt on, you haven't witnessed it yourself, so it's difficult to progress, but as a disciplinary, but equally, you've got a duty of care to the employee. You've also got a duty of care to the reputation of the council. So in that instance, you probably have a chat with them, but then you confirm it in an email to say, look, this behaviour, you've got to wear your seatbelt when you're driving the vehicle. If we get another report, it would be considered a disciplinary matter. You've recorded that in your performance management. So it's an email, which means that it's dated, it's logged, and it's irrefutable evidence that he's been given that warning. There is no such thing as verbal warnings nowadays, technically, but in any event, anything you do give in terms of a warning, even if it's outside of the disciplinary process, I would always recommend you record it with a backup email. If there is poor performance, determine why there is. It could be training, it could be support that they need, it could be that they need some support beyond work. But find out where it is, why there's poor performance, and offer support there. And if necessary, performance manage an employee out of the organisation following your performance management systems. That's in extreme cases, obviously. It's always best if you can find a solution to help them, to enable them to carry out the work well, presumably as they used to. So common mistakes with performance management is The only form of performance management being the annual appraisal. That's not performance management, and you should never just do an annual appraisal and then never speak to the employee again, or the clerk never be talked to again. The classic mistake councils make is they'll only do the appraisal once a year, and just before the appraisal, the chairman will email around the council saying, "What have you got to say about the clerk?" And then a list of grievances will arise, some of them going back 11 months. So the appraisal becomes more like a disciplinary. An appraisal should be a positive experience. If there's negative things to raise with the employee, they should be raised as one-to-ones or in an informal meeting or a formal meeting if necessary during the year, not left until the appraisal. The appraisal should always be a positive experience. So that's a mistake that quite a few councils make by conducting the only one performance review being the annual appraisal, which turns into a disciplinary. We've probably dealt with half a dozen cases where that's happened, resulting in the clerk leaving in one way or another because of the mishandling of the appraisal and the performance management of the clerk. The regular liaison meetings and the chairs I've already mentioned, they are really the one-to-one systems that you need to have in place for the clerk. And the appraisal policy should include professional support, ideally, for the councillors to conduct an appraisal. At my last council, we had it arranged that someone from the county council, HR support, came in to support my appraisal, so that they were getting professional advice on how they conducted the appraisal, which worked very well. So the routes to success: ensure all of your HR policies are in place and you have a system to review them on a regular basis. Ensure that policies and procedures are appropriate to deal with the clerk as well as other officers. Align your appraisals, training and performance management with the council's strategy. Ensure professional support is built into the policies. Get trained to do appraisals if fearful of them. Have a good performance management policy in place. Use the strategy every day, week to determine work priorities and manage performance. Ensure that everyone within the council is aligned around the strategy as well. And if they're not, your strategy is not the right one, you need to have a review of it. Maximize everyone's motivation to succeed. That's an intrinsic motivator, which we haven't got time to cover today. And celebrate success. There's one thing on that list I've realised is not there, that should be there. And one thing we recommend is the councillors that are on your staffing committee, make sure they do HR training, a basic HR training for councillors. We're going to be rolling out an online training programme for that, because we do that all the time at the moment for councils. Some councils actually make it a condition of their standing orders that if you're going to be on the HR committee, you have to do the training course. So if you haven't done the HR training, you can't sit on the staffing committee. It's up to the council if they adopt that. Obviously, it's not compulsory. It's a discretionary decision the council can make. So I will add that to the slides before I send them over to Stuart. But it is something I strongly recommend, is that your councillors who sit on the HR committee are trained in HR. We equally recommend councillors who sit on finance committee get trained in finance, and those that sit in planning get trained in planning as well. It's just good governance to do that within the council. There's a little bit about ourselves. I'm not going to go through that. You're quite happy to have a look at that. And if anyone wants any more details about what we do, we've got the website, but also we can send out one of our digital brochures as well if anyone wants to see anything further. We obviously have a lot of clients. We've got several hundred clients now, and we get lots of positive feedback from different places.